Chapter 29. The sign atop the entrance to the cable car read Teleferico in white letters, and it was with a smidgen of remaining strength that Dan knelt under one of the pylons supporting the motor house of the station. "I can't go a step farther," he whispered into Malou's ear as she crouched down beside him. "I don't know if I can even make it above the platform, hun. I'm so tired." "Don't worry about that. If I've got to drag you up there myself, we'll take the next tram down together. Do you hear me?" Malou was yelling now, as soon as she noticed that her husband was rapidly falling asleep. "Unclasp the rope from your waist, Malou," Damianos ordered as he came near the two of them, still saddled on his mule, "and give it to me." "And what are you going to do?" Malou retorted aghast. "Just do as I say, Malou, and if you want to help him getting up here—" Okay, here you go," she said, unlatching the rope from her waist and handing it to Damianos. He wrapped the end of it to the pommel of the mule's saddle, dismounted and ran down to grab Dan and lift him until he stood up on his own. Then, putting an arm around Dan's waist and one of his arms over his shoulder, he ordered the mule to pull. The beast obeyed instantly and pulled the practically unconscious Dan up the slope until the three of them reached the platform. As soon as they were inside the station and Dan and Malou were sitting on one of the benches, Damianos went to talk to one of the attendants for a minute and soon returned with an emergency oxygen tank and a mask that he fitted over Dan's mouth. When Dan opened his eyes, he tore the mask off his face and stared at Damianos, anger returning to his face. "This was not an exercise in perseverance. That was sheer torture, you miserable creature. Get out of my sight!" "Dan, please calm down," Malou pleaded, quickly taking Dan's face in both her hands. "Please, sweetheart, we've done it. You've done it. We're going down. That's all that counts now." Peering into Malou's gentle eyes, Dan finally relented and looked up at Damianos, who had remained standing, undeterred by Dan's disparaging remark. "You're okay now, my master," their cat said soothingly with a smile drawing on his lips. "I'm sorry, man. I was just angry, I guess. I hate to depend on anyone," Dan said, standing up. "The ride down to the city of Merida will not take too long, but we'll have to change tram car 3 times along the way," Damianos explained as soon as the three of them climbed aboard the second car. "What's the altitude at the top of this Pico Bolivar?" Dan asked, looking around him at the impressive scenery. "I believe the highest peak stands at some 5,000 meters, Damianos replied, pointing to a snow-capped crest in the far distance. "That's nearly 16,000 feet, isn't it?" Malou said. "And how far does this cable go?" "The uppermost station is located about halfway, or about 6,000 feet. "That's why I couldn't catch my breath," Dan told their cat somewhat reproachfully. "But what you need to remember from this experience, Dan, is that you didn't let anyone stop you. The tiredness you felt or the lack of oxygen did not prevent you from persevering to the top of this mountain. As Damien explained to you, nothing short of another accident should stop your progress. You will not be able to climb all the way to the top on your own, like no mountaineer should attempt the scaling of a cliff on his own. Neither should you." "What's in Merida?" Malou asked, trying to switch the topic of the conversation. "Everything your heart may desire, Malou," Damianos replied, grinning. "In 1950 it only counted 50,000 inhabitants, but now it's a large city with a population of 350,000. "Wow, that's what I call an urban growth," Dan exclaimed, amazed. "Will we have a chance to visit the city while we're here?" "I don't know, Dan, but if there was a possibility to visit the ancient buildings, we should. Lots to see." An hour later, Dan and Malou entered the lobby of a small but comfortable-looking hotel, where Damien and Solangi were waiting for them. When they stood up, Solangi smiled. "Goodness, Dan, you look like you've come out of a wash-house. Your face—" "Believe me, Solangi, I feel the way I look, all washed out," Dan replied, shaking his head. "The trek was hard going then," Damien remarked, "but you've made it, and that's the important thing. Come and have a seat, both of you." He indicated a sofa and 2 chairs, furnishing the corner of the lobby. "Damianos will join us later." "I tell you right now, Damien," Dan began, taking a seat beside Malou, "if it weren't for him and his mule, I think Malou and I would still be up there asleep under a pylon." "Ah yes, the lack of oxygen has a tendency to shut one's system down, and it could be very dangerous indeed, but Solangi and I were confident that you would make your way to the top of your mountain." "So glad we did," Malou put in, and like Dan said, it was a touch and go for a minute there. Yes, we noticed that," Solangi said quietly. "You saw us then?" Dan asked, opening his eyes wide. "Of course we did, Dan. We always follow your progress. Truth be told, we can't stay away," Damien said, turning his face to Solangi briefly. "If we had known that you were there, we would have had more courage, maybe." Our presence should not have made any difference to your progress, Dan, but such as it is, I can now tell you that when you return home, we will be there watching you." "Will we be able to talk to either of you?" "Oh no, Malou," Salangi was quick to reply. "But I'm quite sure that you will not need our assistance after you will have completed your tasks. You will have all the tools necessary to forge a beautiful future for yourselves." "Now then, are you ready to have another look at the last chapter of your book?" Damien asked, fixing his gaze on Dan. "I am ready, yes, but I wouldn't mind a bit of sleep to regain some of my strength. I feel drained right now, to tell you the truth." "Very well then, a good meal and a good night's sleep will go a long way in helping you to accomplish your next task, I agree," Damien concluded, throwing an understanding smile to Dan. As they were having breakfast on the terrace of the well-appointed hotel, admiring the imposing sight of the Andes, Dan said, "I wouldn't mind coming back here for a holiday with the kids," throwing a loving glance to Malou, who was sitting across the table from him. "That would be wonderful, but not before you're fully recovered. I don't think it would be a good idea to get you all tired while you're recuperating." "You're right. Besides, I don't think I would venture up Pico Bolivar any time soon," Dan said, laughing as he put down his coffee cup. Tittering still, and picturing Dan travelling everywhere with an oxygen tank strapper over his shoulder and a mask over his mouth, Malou looked toward the terrace door. "Have you ever seen Slaggy or Damien yet this morning?" "Oh, I'm sure the two of them and our Dan cat will make their appearance very soon. Don't worry about that. They're probably plotting the next torture for us before they show themselves." Almost as soon as the words were out of his mouth, Dan noticed Salangi and Damien coming up to the steps leading up from the gardens of the hotel. "What did I tell you? Here they are." "Good morning to you both," Damien said, a genial smile crossing his lips. "Good morning to you too," Dan and Malou exclaimed in unison. "How are you on this beautiful morning?" Salangi asked. "Have you recuperated from your trek up the hill then?" "Oh yes," Dan replied. "We've slept so well. It was hard to get up, but we couldn't resist taking in that gorgeous sunshine though." Sitting down in between the two, Damien reposited the book on the table while Salangi took a seat across from him. "I think you'll find this next task quite relaxing in comparison to the last," Damien said, pushing the book toward Dan. "Let's hope. Let's have a look, shall we?" Dan nodded, smiled, and opened the book to the next page of the last chapter. Depending on the helping hand of others to assist you in your progress demands trust. In most things, one requires another or depending on another to reach a goal, so trusting in your fellow man will be part of this next task. All doubts and uncertainty toward the ones who will guide you to the shore of your goal should be set aside in favour of trust toward those more experienced. Remember, misguided arrogance or self-confidence will only spell trouble for you. "I have a hunch that we're going back to the water," Dan remarked, closing the book. He smiled, thinking of Damienos. He's not going to like it. "You're right, Dan," Damienos said, appearing out of nowhere again, dressed in jeans and t-shirt. "We're going on the water." He looked at Dan and Malou in turn. "Are you ready?" "As we'll ever be," Dan replied, standing up. "I wouldn't stand up if I were you, Dan. You might tip the boat," Damienos noted, pulling him down to the wooden board serving as a seat in the rowboat. Agape, Malou asked, "Where are we?" "Just somewhere where you'll need trust in our guide's judgment," Damienos replied, a smirk on his lips. "But there are houses in the middle of this lake," Dan said, looking around him. "And they're not houseboats. Where is this place?" "Look, Dan, look!" Malou exclaimed, pointing in the direction of a house, in front of which a child seemed to be walking on water. "That's amazing. Does he know where he is? Does he know what he's doing?" Damienos laughed outright. "Yes, is the answer to both of your questions, Malou. The child trusts in his knowledge of this lagoon, which is called Cinemesa, by the way. He has learned where to step and where to walk." He looked at Dan sitting across from him. "The same as you will learn to do, Dan. You will learn where to step, to have trust in your elders and those in the know so that you won't lose your footing." "I get it, Damienos, but if I were to step off this boat right here, right now, how would I know that I would be able to walk on water?" "You won't know until you ask, Dan," Damienos replied after shouting something in Spanish to the men rowing the boat at their back. They treaded the waters for another few minutes until they stopped and one of the rowers climbed over the bench to stand in front of Dan. Clad only of ragged cotton trousers, but his face adorned of an invited grin, he took Dan's hand and indicated for him to stand and to step off the boat. Astounded and babbling his hesitancy, Dan recalled the words of the book, "Trust in your fellow man," and finally stood up and straddled the edge of the rowboat before stepping on the water beneath his feet. My God, Malou, this is fantastic. Look at me, I'm walking on water. Come, give me your hand and we'll walk together. This is extraordinary. Happy and laughing, Malou took Dan's hand, climbed over the edge, and came to stand beside Dan. You're right, this is nothing short than unbelievable. She looked down at the water lapping at her feet. But do not go by yourselves anywhere unless your hand is in the hand of your guide, Damiano shouted from the boat. He will guide you to the house ahead of you, and will meet you there.